Hey there, and welcome to the ACMG Competition tutorials. That one sounded really good, actually, I'm not going to lie. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with the next part of the tutorials. So, in the first one, we created our sprite. Now, this will be the sprite that we get to use in our game. So, how do we add it to our game? That is the question. So, we're going to talk about adding objects into your game. Let's get started in creating your first object. From the Objects menu, go ahead and right-click and hit Create Object, and you will be looking at this awesome new interface for the object. So let's go ahead and figure out what everything is. So up on the left-hand side, we have the name of the object. And just like the sprite, it's going to be named accordingly to object type, objects. So for here, since we're going to be using our SPR player sprite, let's go ahead and just keep it in unison with that. So object, and that's going to be represented by OBJ. And then you can either add an underscore and then name it, or you can just follow that by capital, like I normally do. So, I mean, it doesn't matter. You can be OBJ underscore something, OBJ player, just something that, you know, looks good and keeps uniform through your project. So for the sake of me, I'm just going to name it OBJ, no space, no underscores, and this should be player. And I use camel caps for that. Underneath that, you get to choose your sprite, and you can either click this little drop-down icon, or you can actually click in the box. And let's just go ahead and select our SPR player. Now, if you started by creating an object and you don't have a sprite, which you could do, you can click on New, and then it'll actually create the sprite for you, and you can go through the sprite creation process. But we are not going to be doing that. So instead, we just click our player. Now, if you do have a player or sprite, selected, you can click on Edit, and this will take you to that sprite, so you can go ahead and edit from there. This actually brings me up to something real quick. In your sprites, since we're going to have this player be moving across the screen, a good habit to get stuck into. When you are creating sprites, as you can see here, it is facing up. What we want to do is we want to go to Transform and click on Rotate. Make sure it's 90 degrees clockwise and have them facing right. This way, this is the default zeroed out position because it is in a grid-based movement that we're going to be doing. So I mean, up, down, left, right's fine, but if we ever wanted to rotate, starting here is the 0 point, and then you have it going in 90 degrees increments throughout the entire image. But just click on OK and go ahead and save it. Alright, so some more options about the player. In this case, it's the object for the player. You can set whether this is visible or not, and so this can be something you edit inside the code, and while running the game you can change whether or not the player is visible. The box next to it is solid. Is this object a solid? This is a checkbox for yes or no. Normally for a player you would check solid, but it is not necessary if you're just creating a puzzle piece object or something that doesn't require it to be solid. For this instance, we're going to go ahead and make it solid. This option called persistent is also a checkbox, and this allows it to, as you can see, if it can be persistent between rooms. So if you created this object in room 1, let's say, and you wanted to go ahead and go to room 2, so you do a room go to room 2 function, then this player will also appear in that room with the same exact X and Y location as it did in the previous room. And the X and Y are the coordinates for the player, and we'll get into that when we start doing movement. And then we have this checkbox that says uses physics. Now, if you wanted to create a physics-based game, kind of like Angry Birds or something like that, you can go ahead and check this, and then it brings up a huge list of options. What kind of shape does the collision have? You can modify that collision shape if you want to do checking. Usually, a box is a good place to start if you're going to be doing physics. And then it creates a bunch of variables down here with density, restitution, collision, linear damping, angular damping, friction, and then it has checkboxes down here for how it's handled against other objects. We are not going to really mess with the physics properties. This can be something you explore further if you're going to make it in your game, and you can just check it out by going to the help option and going into their the contents, and you can read more about the physics. With what we make in this tutorial, well, this tutorial series, you will not need the physics, but it is a very good tool to include in your game. So do not disregard this. It is very, very handy. The next thing we're going to talk about is the depth, and this is how the objects are drawn on the screen. So if we have a player, and then we have the player's armor, or the player's gun or weapon, or anything that can change where it's going to be located as far as depth, this is where we would change it. So a player, normally you can put it on 0, or for me, if I know that I'm going to have objects under the player, like grass or tiles or something that I want to add custom, I can change it to maybe a depth of, -3. And the way this works is the higher the number, the further down it is. And just kind of imagine this as stacking blocks or something. Let's see if I can give you a little example here, just to, for the visual people out there. Alright, so here I have paint, and I'm going to give you an example of what it would look like to use this depth. Alright, so here we have our let's go to terrain. This is our terrain, blah, blah, blah. Alright, and this is going to be the top, my amazing handwriting with this mouse, and this is going to be you get the idea. Alright, so let's go ahead and we're going to draw some elements on our map in depth. So this is 0. And then we're going to draw, I don't know, a tree. An orange tree, because orange trees are cool. And another tree. Alright, this would be depth -1. And then further down, we want to draw, I don't know, a worm. Grr. And he is actually underground, so that would be 1 as his depth. So they're drawn in the order of depth, negative numbers being on top, 1 positive numbers being on the bottom. And once you start making your game, it'll make a lot more sense. Alright, so now that we got the depth out of the way with my ridiculous drawing, let's move on. Alright, so the parent, this is kind of like choosing your sprite, except the parent is going to be an object. And these parents, if you have another object that has properties such as health and, I don't know, stamina, then you can use them as a parent to this object, and they will take on the exact same properties as that. So, for instance, I don't have this player as a solid. We'll create a new object that is a solid. Name this the player's parent, and we can go ahead and set it to the parent. Now, this object is not solid, but its parent is solid, thus making this one solid. And it goes further. It can take on the properties of all of its events. Moving on, our mask. This is, let's say our player has a really large sprite, but we only want part of it to be collision based. So let's say this one has a lot of animations, and we only want like a small box to be the collision. This is where we would set it, and it would be another sprite. You just set that as the sprite. Most of the time, it's going to be what you set up in the modify mask section, which we normally use just bounding boxes. So you really shouldn't have to mess with this unless you're getting all into animation and stuff. And then a little bit further down is show information, and this just shows all the information about your sprite, and you can save this, and if you need help with something, you'd save this information, and then you'd copy and paste it into like an email or something. And this, gives the person you're trying to ask for help the information about your object here. Alright, in the events section, there are 2 ways to add events to this. You can either right-click and add an event, or you can just click the Add Event button. And then we are brought to a ton of different options that we are actually not really going to get into at this moment. but let me show it to you. Alright, so I don't know how many of the menus I haven't really seen, but this is, we're not really going to need to get into this because we'll use each of these as we make a game. But you have the create, destroy, the different alarms, the stepping process that renders every frame throughout the game. You have collision with other objects. You have keyboard controls. You have key presses, releases. The drawing event where you can draw your HUD, or you can draw sprites, animations, stuff like that. And then you have other functions that deal with the room, and then you have your mouse functions. And then we won't get into asynchronous stuff, but this would be if you're trying to get social networking, things like that. And then on the right hand side, this is where people who don't really know how to program can just use a drag and drop interface. And so I'm just going to create a create event. And so when this object is created, we can do a bunch of different stuff to it. And it's anywhere from moving to changing the sprite, to destroying it, to checking its health, life, score, anything we want using the drag and drop interface. Most of the stuff that we're going to be doing, though, is going to be on the Controls tab, and it's going to be in the code, where all you have to do is literally hold and drag it into the Events box, and then we can edit stuff through there. But if you don't want to get into code right away and you just want to mess around with the player's properties and stuff, on Create you can, set a speed, a horizontal movement speed of 5. And then when it gets created, it'll move across the screen at 5. And there's tons of different options here that we can mess with. But I'm not necessarily going to get into all these functions because these will be discussed as we add functions to our player, such as movement, animation, all that stuff. But that's going to be a later date. So, now that you know how to create your object, you can go ahead and turn your sprite into an object and go ahead and mess with those properties. In the next tutorial, I will be teaching you how to draw HUD elements, as I talked about, and that you will be able to show score or variables or health or anything that you really want to display, even if it's instructions on how to play your game. So I thank you guys for watching this, and I hope you guys look forward to the next tutorials. See you then.